introducing our next speaker. In the course of teaching government, at some point, my students usually hear me say, the United States has a permanent war economy, an empire of military bases, and is in a state of perpetual war. And the only people in the world who don't know that are the people of the United States. When there is a war, American media often report from a distance. Tel Aviv, Washington, what Robert Fisk, the late journalist of the Independent of London, used to call U.S. official said journalism. Quite distant from the battlefield. Those of us who work for peace historically, we tend to march in streets far distant from the killing and dying. Kathy Kelly, on the other hand, is that rare individual who puts herself directly into the lands invaded and occupied by the United States. It was a group of Marines who were shocked to see Kathy Kelly in the streets of Baghdad in March of 2003 as they drove their tanks through with the Iraqis on the sides of the streets, and also Kathy Kelly. You're an American? Are you serious? The soldiers were shocked to see us, Kathy Kelly was quoted in an article published in the Sun magazine, but we interacted with them for several days. On March 19, 2003, Kathy Kelly described living with the Iraqis. I suppose I'm more prepared than most of my companions for the grueling roar of warplanes, the noise of exploding ordnance. But I feel passionately prepared to insist that war is never an answer, but nothing can prepare me or anyone else for what we could possibly say to the children who will suffer in the days and nights ahead. What can you say to a child who is traumatized or maimed or orphaned or dying? Perhaps only the words we've murmured over and over at the bedsides of dying children in Iraqi hospitals. I'm sorry, I'm so very sorry. In the 1990s, Kathy Kelly and others informed Attorney General Janet Reno of their delegation's mission to deliver food and humanitarian aid in direct violation of the sanctions against Iraq in her more than 15 trips to Iraq during that time. Our speaker, who's been arrested more than 50 times, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her work delivering humanitarian aid directly in Iraq. More than 10 years ago, she led a delegation that walked from Illinois to Des Moines protesting the new drone air base outside of Des Moines Airport. During the occupation of Afghanistan, she made several trips to Kabul and moved within the country, helped to create youth peacemaker teams, and is today working with an international team to help a lot of those young people escape from the rule of the Taliban. She's also on the board of World Without War and is the author of Other Lands Have Dreams, From Baghdad to Peking Prison. So, let's introduce and welcome Kathy Kelly.
Well, good morning. It's wonderful to be in the heartland again, to be with people who come from all over this fine part of the United States. And I'm very, very grateful to the Catholic Peace Ministry, to all of the supporting groups, and how fortunate I am that Luke Clausen and Caleb Stewart combined to help me with technology, which always increases my nervous rash. And Kathleen McQuillan, thank you so much for all of your wonderful organizing energy. So yes, the question, the most profound ethical question in our time: how do we learn to live together without killing one another? Jane Phillips wrote in a book called Lark and Termite of a young soldier just war-weary and desperate to go back home, stuck in Korea, and he says, the planes always come, like planets on rotation, a time to bloodletting with different excuses. And now we who watch genocide on our phone screens know that we cannot say we did not know, There are no excuses. And yet we know that genocide denial is being hung on to by political elites in our country and in Western countries as the killing fields rob the lives of the most innocent of peoples, the children. And so we face a great, great sickness and threat. And these are hard words. They're hard words to look at. So again, I thank you for joining today. And I want to pay a special tribute to Jim Forrest, a Catholic worker. And honestly, I didn't know him very well. But somewhere along the line before COVID spread across this country, he said to me, you know, Kathy Kelly, you really ought to try to use works of art and artists in your presentations. And I said, oh, no, why not? Well, with COVID, all of a sudden, Zoom came into full focus, and so I started to follow Jim Forrest's advice. So I would like to start this time of my remarks with you by appealing to several great artists. I'm not an art historian. I hope many of you will know much more than I do, and maybe it'll generate future conversation. But I'd like to start with some street art. And there you have John Amadon, and I believe that's Poppy Whelan next to him, holding up those banner statements that list the works of war and the works of mercy. And a tremendous contrast. Last night, I was over at the Catholic Worker House. You know, they have 4 houses here in Des Moines, and I was in the house that's dedicated to Chelsea Manning, and in the living room was just such a reality of the works of mercy. People from around the neighborhood, friends, community members, neighbors, Catholic workers, joined a Honduran family who lost their 9-month-old child, Amy. And there was Amy in the wooden box, and the soft moans of her mother, Nicole, while Alexander, her husband, held her. And the tenderness and the kindness and the exhibition of the works of mercy will stay with me for a long time, and every child throughout the world who departs this world unmercifully early had a right to live and laugh and dance and play, and to have those rights guaranteed by those who have stewardship for our world. So the works of mercy: feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give drink to the thirsty, visit the imprisoned, care for the sick, and bury the dead. May I simply say that it was in the heartland. I'm so happy to see people from Kansas City here, Answell and Trout and Margaret, Jersey. I first planted corn on top of a nuclear missile silo site, and I was handcuffed and kneeling in the field, and the soldier had his gun aimed at my head, and the other soldiers had taken off, I think, to find out, okay, what do you do next, and what does chapter 2 say to do? And so I maybe lasted a couple of minutes in silence, and then I asked the young soldier, you know, we had planted corn on top of an intercontinental ballistic missile, and I asked him, do you think the corn will grow? And he said, I don't know, ma'am, but I sure hope so. So then I said, oh, would you like to say a prayer? Yes, ma'am. So I did the St. Francis peace prayer. Lord, make me a channel of your peace. Where there is darkness, let me so light. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is despair, hope. O Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be pardoned as to pardon, to be loved as to love with all my soul. And he said, amen. And then he asked me, ma'am, would you like a drink of water? I said, oh, yes, please. Now I'm handcuffed, right? So then he said, ma'am, would you please tip your head back? I can still feel that water dribbling down my chin. That young soldier took a risk to do an act of kindness for a complete stranger, and I must have seemed pretty strange. But what I want to stay with this morning is his question, would you like a drink of water? Because what if we could say to the children in Gaza environment, what if we could say we don't care about those nuclear weapons in the Negev desert as much as we care about you getting cool, clear, reviving water? And then we could turn to the children in Flint, Michigan, and say the same. And the children in Yemen, and the children in Sudan. And so those works of mercy become so very, very important. Now this is a painting by Peter Bruegel the Elder, which was done in 1564. It was a wicked winter, and the painting was called The Massacre of the Innocents, because you see those people on horseback, they would have been the equivalent of the pilots with the very fearsome, say, F-16 aircraft in our time. You couldn't run away from them. You couldn't confront them. They were the power, and those pogroms, those powerful pogroms, bring terror to many people who were forcibly displaced and whose children were taken from their arms. And so Peter Bruegel, prefacing in the sense, the Gandhian sense of truth force, took his art to the canvas and painted that horrific scene. Well, his work was well known, and the Emperor Rudolph wanted to put a big painting of Peter Bruegel's in his palace, but then he might really not want his military to see them being depicted as marauding terrorists. And so he got his court painters together and he said, look, just, doctor up that painting. Where there's a child being stabbed, make it a sack of flour. Where the soldiers are kidnapping a child, just make it look like a big bird. And so it goes. But Peter Bruegel, the elder, had a son, the younger, and the younger son realized that's not what my dad painted. And he restored the painting to its original reality. And I think it's really important for us today in our time to realize that the powerful elites in the Western countries and in the United States want to cover up a genocide by putting a fig leaf of security. But really, the security that's being promoted in the creation of Greater Israel and in the nuclear threats being waged all around the world involves the security of people in our part of the world being able to take other people's precious and irreplaceable resources at cut-rate prices. It's not a long-term security. And so it's important not to let the militarists boondoggle, bamboozle us into thinking that our security rests in people being able to, quote, protect us with the kinds of horrid weaponry that are constantly being developed, stored, used, or threatened to be used, such as the nuclear weapons that Joseph told us about with so much impact this morning. And so I want to look to Francisco Goya. This is a painting which was unusual in its time, particularly because of the way that the militarists are presented. When Goya did that painting, normally a military person would be astride a horse, would look noble, tremendously athletic, tremendously attractive. How do the military look in this picture? They look like a big spider, like a clump, an arachnid. There's no face to be seen. And the person bathed in light, the person who seems to be more of the protagonist, is somebody who's about to be executed. And this painting comes from the time when the Napoleonic invasion of Spain brought French and other European soldiers into Madrid. It's entitled The 3rd of May. It was done in 1808. And on the 2nd of May, when the invading forces came into Madrid, there was an insurrection. There was an uprising. And so Napoleon's orders were to gather up every single male that could be found and execute those people. And so you see the person whose arms are outstretched, and it's to that person that you would direct, I believe, your sympathies. And so we have today in our time the idea that there's a kind of a nobility to militarism. Well, the greatest threats we face are nuclear annihilation, more pandemics, genocides, and ecological collapse. And militarism exacerbates all of those threats. But we also face the threat that, we also face the threat that with unarmed aerial vehicles, military people can be inside of very protected, dimly lit trailers, as you have here in the Des Moines area, and they can be operating the planes without ever leaving the security, quote, and comfort of their own area. So a group of artists created this photo and installed it in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. That's a province in Pakistan that was populated by many refugees who fled Afghanistan, and they were raising their children in this province in Pakistan. And when the United States began to say, we will hunt down, we will kill anyone who's ever possibly involved in 9/11, they went into this particular province and they attacked Afghan refugees, and they killed the parents of this little girl. She became an orphan. And so artists later, in 2012, created this installation and called it Not a Blood Splat. Because you see, in military parlance now, when the pilots operate a drone and they zero in on someone as a target and they fire, the word is impact, and a Hellfire missile will often be fired from a drone. That Hellfire missile turns the person into a corpse that's hit. And what the pilots actually see is a pool of blood that radiates heat. And so it looks a bit like an amoeba, or in military parlance, blood splat. And so these artists said, any drone operator flying over these fields will see the face of a beautiful little girl. She's not a blood splat. Those who run away are called scourgers. It's not a way to treat our young people in terms of training. Now, this little girl certainly understood that notion, not a blood splat. She was in Iraq at the Dijla school in Baghdad. And when I met her, she's not so little, I think she was 16. And she stood up and she said, you come and you say, you will do, but nothing happens. Me, I am 16. Can you tell me what is the difference between me, I am 16, and someone, she is 16 in your country? I'll tell you, our emotions are frozen. We cannot feel. But actually, her emotions had come unfrozen. She had tears streaming down her face. And we, I believe, can never ignore the voices of those who are forcibly displaced by, or orphaned by, or maimed by, or starved by our war. Salman Rushdie wrote, those who are forcibly displaced by war are the shining shards that reveal the truth. Caleb, I need your, there. And so I also want to show the picture from which that little girl's face was cropped. She's there with her two brothers, and they're holding the shrapnel that killed their parents. I'm just not doing it right. There we go. So one of my favorite artists is a very great fellow named Dr. Wafa Bala, also from Iraq. And he came to Chicago, and he was a refugee from Iraq. He was for 3 years in a Saudi refugee camp, and it's only now as I get to know my young Afghan friends and I'm far more aware of how hard it is to be in these camps. But when he got to Chicago, he went right to the School of Art, the Art Institute in Chicago, and began to thrive. And then he learned that his brother Haj in 2004 had just been going through a checkpoint in Baghdad. Somehow his car was targeted by a United States warplane and his brother Bash was killed instantly. And so Wafaa had to remember. He had to find a way to remember the vulnerability of so many people all across Iraq. So he devised a cubicle in an art gallery, and he made a paint gun. And he got himself some protective gear, and he loaded the paint gun up with yellow paint pellets, and he moved in behind a plexiglass shield. And he dwelled there for a month. And online, all around the world, anyone could aim that paint gun and shoot an Iraqi. 60,000 people tried to shoot Wafaa over the course of that month. If he got up to go to the bathroom, he had to quit up often. And yet there were some people who would instead have chats with him. Hello, my brother. I'm sorry for what you're experiencing. We want peace now. So it went both ways with 60,000 people. That's a trauma, but it wasn't enough for Wafaa, who when he got to New York was still compiling a lengthening list of Iraqis being killed by U.S. weapons. And so he decided that he would ask the help of a tattoo artist. And on his back is a map being tattooed and filled in of the country of Iraq. And up at the top you can say Suleimania and Mosul. And for every person that was killed, as the woman at the microphone is reading the names of the Iraqis who were killed, that name was tattooed on Wafaa's back. But the only ones you could see with this sort of naked eye were the American soldiers. Because he said the Iraqis are largely invisible, so you need an ultraviolet light to see those names. And after 25,000 names were tattooed on Wafaa's back, there wasn't any more room. And so the people together read and beheld the remainder of the 190,000 names. Inscribed on the wall across from the United Nations are the beautiful words from the book of Isaiah. It begins with the question, when shall come the day when they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks? Nation shall not continue to lift the sword against nation, neither shall they continue to learn the ways of war any longer. And so that plowshares quote continues to hold a very real hope for us, and yet, as Joseph pointed out to us all across the United States, the companies relentlessly continue to do just the opposite. And so we have Dwight Eisenhower's words, every rocket fired, every warship launched is a theft against those who are poor, those who are hungry. So I was in Jordan about 6 months ago, Amman, Jordan, and I was with a lovely group of high school students. And I asked them, okay, let's do a thought exercise. The United States has at least, in the world there are 867 military bases, and the U.S. controls somewhere in the vicinity of 790 to 800 something of those bases. So suppose I have enough power to give each one of you a base. Tell me what you'll do with your base, but you can't have any weapons, and you can't have any soldiers carrying weapons. Well, it was immediate. They couldn't wait to tell me what they would do with their base. They would use their base to help solve incurable cancers. They would use their base to welcome refugees. Their base would become a place of research for solar energy, for wind energy, for all the sensible good things you can do, things that the United Nations is dedicated to do in order to eliminate the scourge of warfare for future generations, but things we don't do because instead the choice is made again and again and again to shore up our military-industrial complex, even though it doesn't defend us from the greatest threats that we face. And so I think about these children from Afghanistan, really little prophets, all of them. And most of the ones in that photo were street children. When we would ask their mothers, what's your source of income? Who is the highest income earner? Again and again, it would be a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old child. And so those kids gathered together for a street kids school. It was a wonderful project. The Afghan peace volunteers tutored the younger ones in their language, Dari and math, and they had nonviolence classes every Friday. And in those nonviolence classes, they were kind of coached, encouraged to stop thinking that having a gun, a toy gun, any kind of a gun, was cool. And so they took the Plowshares quote to heart. They collected as many plastic toy guns as they could, and then little Amira is in front with a yellow plastic hammer, and it's her turn to beat the guns into shards of plastic, which they then buried and they planted a tree on top of it. They planted thousands of trees, the young Afghan peace volunteers dedicating themselves to permaculture. They had a duvet project and they help widows make very warm, life-saving, heavy blankets, because in the refugee camps in Afghanistan, in the winter months, with the cold and the snow and the harsh winds, children were dying of hypothermia. So these youngsters did everything they could to overcome borders, to imagine a world where they really could abolish war. And now they've had to flee for their lives. The very fact that they welcomed Westerners like myself, I think I went there 30 times, put them in jeopardy. And so I've now been watching them fan out in other places all around the world. And wonderfully, permaculture experts, particularly right now in Portugal, have welcomed them to come there. But this thought exercise, what we could do if we weren't so busy building the walls and stigmatizing the very people whom we've turned into homeless, displaced people because of our foolish forever wars. And not only are the people homeless and displaced, but their lands are contaminated and scarred. I was in Lebanon in 2006 after the Israeli-Lebanon war, and I was in a home. I wanted to be helpful, and all the windows had been blown out, and there was broken glass everywhere, and I thought, well, at least I can sweep up the broken glass. So I filled 2 great big cardboard boxes, and there was still more broken glass, and the mother wasn't in the home. We were staying there as guests of her son, who was 20-something years old, and I started to fill up a glad bag, but glass in the glad bag didn't work. And so I said, well, Mohammed, can I dump this out in the garden and then I'll have another container free? And he said, oh no, my mother, she is a gardener, she does not want broken glass in her garden. Well, Chicago, and that wasn't my first thought. I said, okay, I figured, well, I don't think she wants broken glass in her kitchen either, but next morning, there was a knock at the door. It was probably somebody from Hezbollah. By law, I'm not supposed to talk with that person. I could actually be accused of terrorism for talking with a Hezbollah official who had come to let me know, please, madame, just would you look at what is in the garden? And it was an unexploded cluster bomb. If I had dumped the broken glass onto the cluster bomb, I might not have been here telling you this anecdote. 2 million cluster bombs scattered all across Lebanon. And now, in 1 week, 1.5 million people displaced in Lebanon. And people talk about the tunnels under Gaza, and I'll tell you, I know those tunnels were there. I was in Gaza in 2009 and 2013 during the tremendous bombings then when Gaza was an open-air prison, and the only way that you could get diapers, nappies, jackets, was through the tunnels, and yes, weapons came through the tunnels. And yes, I will still say, you can't be a vegetarian between meals, and you can't be a pacifist between wars. But my friends, let us never let go of truth wars. And truthfully, where do you find the most egregious weapon, the most terrible flaunting of international law and human rights? Where do you find it? In Israel. Go to the Negev Desert, to the Shimon Peres nuclear research facility, where Israel has created and stored at least 80 thermonuclear weapons. Some say 240, it could be 400 or more. Mordecai Vanunu did 18 years, 13 of them in solitary confinement, for telling the world what the CIA already knew. And if we're going to talk about tunnels, well, let's just imagine the kind of a tunnel that would have to be dug in order to bring into Israel for use to burn and maim and terrorize people. The F-16 bombers, the Apache helicopters, the Hellfire missiles, the D-9 bulldozers, the rounds and rounds and rounds of ammunition, the tank-fired missiles like the ones that killed Hindradab and her family members. Who are the terrorists? This is the question entrusted to me by a mother in Lebanon in 2006. And then she tapped the plastic over a picture of her 6-year-old child, and she looked at me and asked another question. Is she the terrorist? And we were at the funeral for that child. Who are the terrorists, and how can we stop? How can we create civil society strong enough to turn around this incredibly powerful war machine? Well, one thing we can't do is give up. Phil Berrigan used to go to demonstration after demonstration, and he'd say, don't get tired. War wearied us, but the world can't afford our despair. And Albert Camus, at the end of World War II, remarked, we're in history up to our necks. But I, for my part, will wage the formidable gamble that words are stronger than munitions. Have consequences. And that's why for the United Nations today, if Israel can continue with impunity, and the United States with impunity, with no consequences, then the edifices of international law that have been set up so far will be crumbling and unraveling constantly, and it may not be possible to rebuild them. Again, I thank Joe Gerson for thinking about this so hard. What will we do if those edifices that at least have some nod to a definition of human rights become undone? And at this point, it's the right of those with the most power. Might makes right. It's being used to determine who gets to live and who must die. I include this picture because Jerry Zawada and Charlie Lickey and myself and Neville Watson and others, on a cloudy day, right before a huge windstorm, on day 4 of a fast that we had declared, are holding large vinyl pictures of some of the most beautiful children we could ever encounter, Iraqi children. And we're right at the border before the 2003 war between Iraq and Kuwait. And Charlie Lickey had big, strong lungs and a big, strong voice, Purple Heart soldier who'd become a conscientious objector, and he shouted as hard, loud as he could, and I know they heard him on the other side, don't do it. Follow your conscience. But of course, at that point, after soldiers have been trained to say 300 times a day, kill, 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 and they've been made vulnerable in boot camp to the terrible propaganda that asserts that some people are not fully human. It's very difficult for the soldiers to retrieve their conscience, but we have to remember, here in the United States, on average, 18 to 22 combat veterans kill themselves every day. And I am quite sure that the lasting savagery of the Israeli soldiers waging their war against Palestinians will have a moral injury and a profound, profound impact on the soldiers and their families for a long time to come. Doesn't at all help to demonize soldiers or to demonize anyone. And actually, I had a chance to kind of return the favor to that soldier who gave me water at the military base, Whiteman Air Force Base in Kansas City that early morning when we planted corn on the nuclear missile silo sites. When the Marines rolled into Baghdad in front of the Al-Fanar Hotel on Sharia Abu Mas, some of us were up on the second floor balcony and we said, they look kind of thirsty, you know? My friend Cynthia Banna said, oh, I'm so glad you said that. Of course, that's the right thing to do. And Cynthia took 2 big, heavy 6-packs of water and went down to bring the water to the newly arrived Marines. And I followed. I was a little bit hesitant, you know, shouldn't we have a consensus meeting about this? But, and I realized, you know, every household in Iraq, no matter how poor, and some were desperate, always sat you down, made sure that you had water, and if they had enough money, they'd send one of the kids out to get you Coca-Cola. So yes, it was the right thing to do, and we learned from the Marines that some of them were hoping that it wouldn't register in their minds. One young fellow said to me, we did some terrible things on our way into this city, and there was one night when we weren't sure, was they military or was they civilian? So we shot everybody. But I hope it doesn't register here, man, you know what I mean? I hope it doesn't register here. So we're in that betwixt and between, because we have to let it register in our hearts, in our minds, in our wills, develop the political will as civil society to put an end to the killing, and knowing that the accountability will be very, very, very hard to establish because many of the perpetrators are running to the banks with their coffers full. They're becoming billionaires. They're becoming the wealthiest of elites all around the world, and they don't want the killing to end. It's not in their immediate self-interest. This is a painting by Sally Latch. She called it Basta. And, you know, it's interesting that really the strongest person, or the strongest entity in the painting, isn't the warplanes in the background. It's the woman holding the lifeless body. And in a way, she reminds me of Francisco Goya's main character. It's important to look at the world as it might be understood by China right now. You know, there's a general, Charles Richard, who said that in a war with China, a nuclear exchange would not be probable. It would not be just a possibility, it would be a probability. And yet, the United States continues to militarize the region, to light or ignite more differences, when truly what we need to do is collaborate with China in order to deal with pandemics, in order to deal with avoiding nuclear annihilation, and in order to deal with ecological collapse. But for people in China, we should certainly understand that every one of those U.S. flags represents a United States military base. Every one of the sort of mushroom cloud graphics represents a nuclear facility. And so China, it's true, could become the world hegemon that replaces the United States. Think about how China is investing in the Belt and Road Initiative. Think about how China is building the BRICS associations. There are new networks, unquestionably, being developed, but with ecological collapse, Alfred McCoy of the University of Wisconsin, big welcome to our Wisconsin friends here, Alfred McCoy says that by 2050, Shanghai would be underwater and the Gobi Desert would be unlivable. People would bathe if they went outside their homes. And so that's again pointing to the tremendous need to collaborate, to get our scientists together, to completely eschew any kind of nuclear weaponry along with the nuclear threats and find a new way forward. Certainly, in this time of great terror, if we could actually get the member states of the United Nations to enact what's called the Uniting for Peace mechanism. It exists, and part of the reason it exists is because a commission which was convened to focus on the crisis in Gaza has never been deconvened. It still exists. And so the Palestinian Authority, Palestine now having status at the United Nations, could put forward a new ceasefire resolution, a strong ceasefire resolution, one with consequences. They could do it, and if the Security Council vetoed it, probably at the behest of the United States, if it wasn't something that Netanyahu would have crafted himself, if that resolution is vetoed, it would take a 2/3 majority of the member states of the United Nations and 7 of the Security Council members to overturn the decision of the Security Council to veto a ceasefire resolution. It's been taking an agonizing long time to move the apparatus within the United Nations so that this kind of development could be anticipated. Don't anticipate the Western powers, the Western states, led by the US and the UK, being the ones to take leadership. But let's not give up on the possibility that non-Western states could make a crucial and a positive difference in the enactment, potentially, of a Uniting for Peace resolution. And I think that, we've certainly seen what we wouldn't have expected in so many of the demonstrations all around the world. Weekly, millions of people turning out. The grassroots momentum is clearly there. I'm very grateful to our Jewish brothers and sisters in Jewish Voice for Peace, for the rabbis who've taken leadership, for Not in Our Name, and for the student movement. May I say to every student in this room, thank you for your courage, your leadership, your conscientious motivation, and we need you. Follow the young people. But it seems to me that the last word in our very crucial time right now really ought not to come from a human being, because we have to listen. There's so many species out there. Our world is unraveling, and yet we're all part of one another, including the non-human beings. So I don't know if this will work, but Caleb's been helping me all along. And do you know that on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, the last day of World War I, at the 11th hour, the 11th minute, and Barry Reich, I know, will back me up on this, because the vets for peace in Minnesota every Armistice Day ring the bells at that point. At that 11th minute, the gunfire, the explosions continued right up until the very last minute of that industrialized slaughter. And then there's an eerie silence. And then listen very carefully. I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but I can direct you to where to go online if not. cannot take away everything. You cannot forbid us to sing. You cannot stop the tears that flow. And you can't stop the song that we sing. You cannot take away everything. You cannot forbid us to think. You cannot stop the tears that flow. And you can't stop the song that we sing. Thank you very much. I need to check the time. Sorry, Kathleen and I said that I would remain here if you had any comments or questions. But Caleb, what time is it?
It's 11:37. People can go to your couch, unless you wanted anyone to ask me what's up.
So, comments, questions are very welcome. And there is an extra microphone here.